Yo, family, pull up, sit down, lock the door behind you, because what I'm about to walk you through is going to rearrange your entire understanding of what's really cooking between the game and Kendrick Lamar right now, and I promise you, by the time we hit the back half of this, you're going to be sitting there with your jaw on the floor asking yourself how nobody else connected these dots yet. The game just torched every bridge he had left with Kendrick Lamar in one weekend, and the receipts are so loud, so damning, and so publicly documented that there is officially no coming back from this. None. Zero. The door is welded shut. And Kendrick Lamar? Kendrick Lamar hasn't said one word. Not a bar. Not a tweet. Not a whisper. And that silence, that terrifying, surgical, executioner's silence, is doing more damage to the game than any diss track ever could. Real talk. This is the moment the culture writes down. This is the moment we're going to look back at 3, 5, 7 years from now and say, that was the day the game finished himself off in slow motion while Kendrick Lamar sat back and let the man dig his own grave with a shovel he bought himself. Before I go any deeper into this thing, do me one solid, family. Smash that like button, get subscribed to the channel if you ain't already, because I promise you the way I'm about to break down what the game did, why Kendrick Lamar isn't responding, and what Wack 100 accidentally revealed on camera this weekend. You are not getting this level of clarity anywhere else on the internet. Straight up. Now, let's get into it. Here's where we are. We have been talking about the game on this channel more than we've talked about almost any other rapper this whole run. And I've been asking myself the question over and over, is the game actually doing himself any favors by staying in the news cycle this hard? Because when the game is in the conversation, and it's not for music, historically, it becomes a problem for the game. And this last stretch has been the loudest example of that pattern we have ever seen. Look at the Versus situation. Look at how it played out. That was a moment, a real, gift-wrapped, once-in-a-decade moment, where the game could have stood up on that stage and reminded the entire hip-hop world exactly why he considered himself untouchable in his prime. Exactly why he thought getting left off certain lists was a crime against the culture. The game had the microphone. The game had the audience. The game had the moment. And what did the game do with it? The game grabbed a bottle of Don Julio, drank it like it owed him money, and put his hands on women who did not look comfortable being touched. I'm not going to overreach and tell you exactly what those women were feeling, because I wasn't in their heads, but I've got eyes, and I've got a heart, and what I saw was uncomfortable. And that has been the residue that has followed the game into every single conversation since. Then we get into the third verse podcast situation. And I told y'all at the time, I said it on this channel, plain as day, I don't actually think there was ever a beef between Kendrick Lamar and the game. I said what I saw looked like Kendrick Lamar making a very deliberate, very quiet decision to walk away from somebody. Not a war. Not a hit list. Just a man closing a door and choosing not to explain himself. And I stand by that read. Because sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is not slam the door. Sometimes the loudest thing a man can do is close it softly and never open it again. That is what Kendrick Lamar did. Kendrick Lamar didn't need to release a statement. Kendrick Lamar didn't need to write a diss. Kendrick Lamar didn't need to explain himself to anybody. Kendrick Lamar just quietly stepped out of the room, and everybody with any sense understood exactly what that meant. But, and this is the part where the whole thing pivots, this weekend, the game decided he could not leave that quiet alone. And that's when the timeline exploded. Straight up, I'm going to walk you through this like I'm seeing it in real time, because I need y'all to feel the same whiplash I felt. The game just went on record, publicly, threatening to expose Kendrick Lamar and everybody affiliated with TD. Publicly. On the record. Not a subtweet. Not a whisper campaign. An actual threat from the game's own account, aimed directly at Kendrick Lamar's inner circle. And it did not just come from nowhere. It came right on the heels of a Wack 100 clip that is, without exaggeration, the wildest piece of PR gymnastics I have ever seen a human being attempt in real time. Let me walk you through it. Wack 100 sits down on a podcast. The interview is with Chick Smooth. Love to Chick Smooth. That man has been putting in serious work on YouTube. I've told y'all about him before, and Wack starts spinning a story that we've heard him try to spin before. Which is that back in the day, allegedly, the game was in Top Dog's ear trying to sign Kendrick Lamar. According to Wack, allegedly, the game recognized what Kendrick Lamar was going to be before anybody else did, and allegedly the game asked Top Dog multiple times to let the game bring Kendrick Lamar over. And Wack tells this story like it's gospel. Like it's settled fact. Like nobody is going to check him on it. Here's the problem. We already checked him on it. The last time Wack ran the same story, Kendrick Lamar's own bodyguard, Kendrick Lamar's actual, in-the-room security, came out publicly and said none of that ever happened. Said Wack was making it up. Said the meeting Wack keeps describing was fiction. And then, just like that, the story quietly disappeared. Wack didn't push back. Wack didn't produce receipts. The story just vanished. And now, months later, we're getting the exact same recycled fantasy dressed up in a fresh suit. Explain that to me. Explain to me how you go on a podcast and tell a story that has already been debunked publicly by the person closest to the subject, and just hope nobody remembers. Do that math for me. Because it doesn't add up. And that's really the thesis of this entire situation. That's the through line. The game and the people around the game keep telling stories that don't survive the first round of fact-checking, and they keep hoping the culture has short-term memory. And on this channel, we don't have short-term memory. We have receipts. We have timestamps. We have footage. Now here's where it gets even crazier. The very same weekend that Wack 100 is out here recycling this fictional story about the game almost signing Kendrick Lamar, the game himself goes on the record telling a completely different narrative. The game says publicly, plainly, on camera, that he has no issues with Kendrick Lamar. None. That there is no beef. That he loves Kendrick Lamar. That Kendrick Lamar is his brother. That the whole thing is being blown out of proportion by content creators trying to get views. The game literally sits there and tells the world, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is the exact spirit of it, that all this internet noise is manufactured, and that behind the scenes he and Kendrick Lamar are on good terms. And I want y'all to lock that in, remember that message, because it is about to become the most important detail in this entire breakdown. So the game says on Monday, there's no beef with Kendrick Lamar. And then the game says on Tuesday, and I want to make sure I read this correctly because it is somehow more brazen than what I already described. The game posts publicly threatening to pull down the curtain and expose Kendrick Lamar's entire operation. The game calls Kendrick Lamar's camp a circus of clowns. The game says one day he's going to reveal who these people really are. The game says the fans and the goofies on the internet will never get it. Family, do the timeline math with me one more time. On Monday, there is no beef. On Tuesday, there is a public threat to expose the man you say there is no beef with. Which one of those is the truth? Because they can't both be. That is not how truth works. That is not how any of this works. You cannot claim peace on the phone and then go declare war on the timeline 6 hours later. That is not peace. That is posturing. That is a man with a grenade in his hand pretending it's a business card. And this is where I want to zoom in on something even deeper, because a lot of y'all in the comments have been asking me the real question, the underneath question. Y'all been asking me, why does the game care this much? Why is the game so emotionally invested in what Kendrick Lamar thinks of the game? And I've been sitting with that question, family, and I think I finally have an answer for y'all, and it is going to be uncomfortable to hear. The reason the game can't let this go is because Kendrick Lamar's silence is the loudest possible referendum on the game's place in the culture right now. When the game came up, the game was the West Coast. Full stop. Whatever else you want to say about the game, and there's plenty to say, you cannot say the game wasn't carrying the flag in an era when the flag was heavy. The game was Compton's ambassador when Compton didn't have another mainstream voice. And for a long stretch, that was the game's identity. That was the thing that made the game feel like the game. But time did what time does. Time moved. Time introduced Kendrick Lamar to the world, and Kendrick Lamar didn't just take Compton's torch. Kendrick Lamar took the whole conversation, took the Pulitzer, took the Super Bowl, took the crown, and did it all without ever needing to raise his voice. And the game, I'm telling you this, because I've watched it up close, the game has been trying to force his way back into that conversation ever since. And every time it doesn't work, the game reaches for something louder. That's the pattern. It's not new. It's not a mystery. Look at the last 2 years. Every time Kendrick Lamar has had a moment, the game has had a reaction. Every time. Every single time. And that is not the behavior of a man at peace with his legacy. That is the behavior of a man haunted by somebody else's shadow. Now, let's rewind to the Wack 100 clip one more time, because there is a detail in there that I don't want y'all to miss. Wack sits on camera and tries to argue that the game shouldn't be considered a problem lyrically. Wack tries to argue that the game has gone bar for bar with the biggest names in hip-hop and lived to tell about it. And then, and this is the part where I nearly threw my phone across the room, Wack tries to explain away the fact that Kendrick Lamar had a real, documented, quiet issue with the game about the Compton video shoot that featured Drake. And here is what Wack claims. Wack claims that if there had been an issue, Kendrick Lamar or Top Dog would have called him, would have called the game's camp, would have raised the flag. Wack claims he never got that call. Wack claims because that call never came, the whole thing must be exaggerated. Then Stat, the same Stat who was on third verse, comes out and says the opposite. Stat says on the record that yes, that call absolutely did happen. Stat says Top Dog himself communicated to Wack and to Chuck that there was a problem with the Compton video shoot when it was happening. Stat says the message was received and the message was ignored. Family. That is not a small contradiction. That is not a technicality. That is one camp saying we told you and the other camp saying you never told us, and only one of those camps can be telling the truth. And when I sit here and I weigh Stat against Wack, and I look at the track record of each, and I look at how many stories Wack has floated that have been debunked publicly in the last 2 years, I know which side of the ledger I'm putting my chips on. Straight up. And that is the moment right there, where the entire game defense collapses. Because if that call happened, then the game knew. And if the game knew, then bringing Drake to Compton for that video shoot wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. It was a deliberate decision to move in a way that the game had been warned would violate a brother's comfort zone. You do not do that to somebody you consider family. You do not do that to somebody from your own city. You do not do that to somebody who came out of the same organization. You do that to somebody you're testing. And that is what Kendrick Lamar felt. And that is why Kendrick Lamar closed the door. And that is why Kendrick Lamar is not opening it back up, not for a phone call, not for an apology, not for anything. But the game still thinks the phone is going to ring. I want y'all to sit with that for a second, because this might be the most heartbreaking part of the whole story. The game genuinely, publicly, has stated that if Kendrick Lamar had picked up the phone at the right moment, the game would have fixed everything. The game would have gotten Drake on the line. The game would have made it right. The game says this like a man convinced the phone still has a dial tone. Family, that phone was disconnected years ago. That number changed. That line is dead. And every time the game reaches for it, every time the game holds it up to his ear and waits for Kendrick Lamar to be on the other end, all Kendrick Lamar hears is static. Because Kendrick Lamar is not on the phone anymore. Kendrick Lamar has moved on. Kendrick Lamar has bigger things happening. Kendrick Lamar has a Super Bowl in the rearview and a legacy under construction, and Kendrick Lamar does not owe the game a reconciliation tour. Now here's the tripwire. Here is the moment nobody wants to say out loud, but I'll say it because that's what we do on this channel. If the game truly, actually, sincerely has files on Kendrick Lamar, if the game genuinely has this locked and loaded exposure package that the game keeps threatening to release, then drop it. Drop it. Put it on the internet. Write the record. Make the post. Do the interview. If it exists, release it, because at this stage of the play, the game has nothing left to lose with Kendrick Lamar. The relationship is done. The friendship is finished. The phone call is not coming. So what exactly is the game preserving by holding this alleged information back? Nothing. There's nothing to preserve. And that tells me that the exposure package doesn't exist the way the game wants us to think it exists. Because if it did, we would have seen it already. If the game truly had a kill shot in the chamber, the game would have already pulled the trigger. Instead, the game keeps holding up the gun, showing us the gun, waving the gun around, and never firing it. That is not a man with ammunition. That is a man with a bluff. And the culture sees the bluff. Which brings us to what happened in downtown LA this weekend, because this is the part of the story that I don't think has fully sunk in yet for a lot of y'all. The game performed a free show in Los Angeles this weekend. His hometown. His backyard. Compton's own. And the reception, family, the reception was ice cold. I've been watching the footage that fans have been uploading, and I've been reading the comments underneath it, and I have to tell you, a lot of the natives, a lot of the actual on-the-ground West Coast community, are saying out loud what a lot of the industry has been too polite to say. They don't rock with the game the same way anymore. Not because the game isn't talented. Not because the game doesn't have classics. But because the game has spent the last 2 years doing everything except making the music that got him to the dance in the first place. And the crowd noticed. The city noticed. The internet noticed. And in the middle of that show, the game did something that I've been sitting with ever since I saw the clip. The game got on the microphone in front of that thin LA crowd, and the game started reflecting. The game started talking about death. The game started talking about the family he's lost. The game started talking about his mother being sick. The game started talking about how when he dies, he wants to be remembered as a son of the West Coast. Family. That was not a concert speech. That was an SOS in slow motion. That was a flare gun going up in the fog. That was a man on a stage, in his home city, in front of a crowd that used to worship him, giving what sounded to me like a farewell. And I want to say this with as much love and as much sincerity as I can put into words. If any part of the game is not okay right now, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, I hope the people around the game are paying attention. I hope his real circle is checking in. Because forget the beef. Forget the timeline. Forget Kendrick Lamar. A human being who is publicly rehearsing his own eulogy on a concert stage is a human being who needs somebody in his corner right now. And that is bigger than hip-hop. But, and this is the part where I have to put my journalist hat back on, I also cannot ignore the pattern. Because we have seen this movie before. We have seen artists reach for the sympathy narrative right before an album drops. We have seen the meltdown to music pipeline play out in real time more than once. And multiple insiders are now confirming that the game has been locked in the studio all week outside of these appearances. So the question I have to ask, and the question I want y'all to weigh in on down in the comments, is what we just watched an authentic breaking point, or is it the opening act of a rollout? Is the game genuinely spiraling, or is the game architecting a comeback narrative in front of our eyes? Because both of those things can be true at the same time. Both of those things can be present in the same footage. And I want y'all to tell me where you land, because I've been going back and forth on this all week, and I don't think I'm going to have a clean answer without hearing from y'all first. Now here's what I do know for a fact. I know that if the game releases a Kendrick Lamar diss record in the next 30 days, that record is going to be the loudest, most aimed, most in-your-face volley we have heard from the game in years. I know that record is not going to be subtle. I know the game is going to expect Kendrick Lamar to respond. And I know with every fiber of my being that Kendrick Lamar is not going to respond. Not one bar. Not one line. Not one whisper. Because Kendrick Lamar's answer to the game was already delivered. And Kendrick Lamar's answer was silence. And that silence is not going to break for the game. Not now. Not next month. Not next year. That silence is permanent. And every time the game screams into it, every time the game throws another rock at that wall, all the game is going to hear back is his own echo bouncing off Kendrick Lamar's closed door. And that, family, is the tragedy of this entire arc. Because the game does not have a Kendrick Lamar problem. The game has a game problem. The game has spent so many years positioning himself as a warrior in every conversation that the game forgot how to just be an artist in one of them. The game forgot that the biggest flex in this game is not who you can fight, it's who chooses to fight you back. And Kendrick Lamar has decided, publicly, permanently, and without commentary, that the game is not on that list. Kendrick Lamar is not fighting the game. Kendrick Lamar is not answering the game. Kendrick Lamar is not acknowledging the game. And in the culture we live in the streaming era we live in the algorithm-driven attention economy we live in, being ignored by Kendrick Lamar is the single most devastating verdict a rapper can receive. Because Kendrick Lamar's silence is not neutral. Kendrick Lamar's silence is a statement. Kendrick Lamar's silence says, you are not on my level, you are not on my radar, and you are not worth the ink. Let me pull the lens all the way back for a second and give y'all the big picture takeaway, because I want to make sure this lands. What we are witnessing right now, in real time, is the slow-motion collapse of one of the most complicated legacies in West Coast hip-hop history. The game is not going out with a diss album that shakes the culture. The game is going out with a series of interviews, a series of social media posts, a series of concert speeches, and a series of threats that never quite materialize. And every single move the game makes to try to reclaim relevance is making the game smaller. Every timeline threat. Every recycled Wack 100 fable. Every free show meltdown. Every phone call that never gets returned. Each one shaves another inch off the game's stature, and the game either does not realize it, or has decided that shrinking loudly is better than fading quietly. And I don't know which of those two is worse. Kendrick Lamar, meanwhile, has not tweeted. Kendrick Lamar has not posted. Kendrick Lamar has not commented. Kendrick Lamar is somewhere in a studio, or somewhere with his family, or somewhere on a beach, doing exactly what Kendrick Lamar has always done, building the next thing. And when the next Kendrick Lamar project drops, because it is going to drop, and it is going to drop when we least expect it, the game will not be a footnote on it. The game will not be a bar on it. The game will not be a shadow on it. The game will simply not exist inside the world Kendrick Lamar is building next. And that, family, is the exposure. That is the real exposure. Not the one the game keeps threatening on the timeline. The exposure of being written out of the story entirely. The exposure of being uninvited from the era. The exposure of being made irrelevant by omission. So where do we go from here? Here's my honest read, and y'all know I'm going to give it to y'all straight. I think the game drops something in the next 2 to 4 weeks. I think it's going to be aimed. I think there are going to be shots at Kendrick Lamar, at TD, at Top Dog, at Stat, at anybody the game feels has locked him out of the conversation. I think it is going to trend for 48 hours. And I think by hour 72, we are going to be right back in the exact same conversation we are having today, because Kendrick Lamar is not going to move an inch, and the game is going to be left holding a diss record in a hallway that has already emptied out. That is my honest prediction. And I want y'all to remember I said it here, because when it plays out exactly the way I just described, I want the receipts on the timeline. Before I get out of here, and I mean this sincerely, family, from the bottom of what I do on this platform, I want y'all to drop your verdict in the comments below. Tell me where you land on all of this. Do you think the game is genuinely spiraling and this is a real cry for help that needs to be taken seriously? Do you think this is a strategic, calculated rollout designed to sell a comeback album? Do you think Kendrick Lamar should break the silence? Or do you think Kendrick Lamar is doing the exact right thing by keeping the door welded shut? And most importantly, do you think the game has anything real to expose, or is the game holding a bluff and hoping nobody calls it? I want to hear all of it. I read every comment. I respond to as many as I can. And the temperature down there is going to shape the follow-up video, so make your voice heard. Now while you're at it, smash that like button one more time for me, get the algorithm moving, get this video in front of the people who need to see it, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe and turn the bell on. Because I promise you when the next chapter of this story breaks, and it is going to break, probably within days, you want to be the first one in the room when we break it down. And speaking of chapters, I already have the follow-up locked and loaded, because there is a piece of this puzzle I did not touch today. And it involves a phone call that allegedly took place between somebody in Kendrick Lamar's camp and somebody in the game's camp that neither side has publicly acknowledged yet, and I've got sources on both sides trying to give me the fuller picture. As soon as I can put it together in a way I can stand behind, that video is dropping. So stay ready. I'll say it once and I'll say it loud. The game is not going to win this one. Not with a diss record. Not with an exposure post. Not with a meltdown speech. Not with a threat. Because Kendrick Lamar already won it. Kendrick Lamar won it the day Kendrick Lamar decided the game was not worth a response. And every day the game keeps talking, Kendrick Lamar wins it a little more. The game is out here trying to fight a war that Kendrick Lamar already left the battlefield of, and every swing the game takes just hits empty air. That's the story. That's the whole story. And now y'all have it before anybody else on the internet does. Appreciate every single one of y'all. Real love from me to you. See you in the next one. Peace.